Hi, I'll keep this intro short because I know the video is already quite long. Today I spoke with Suzanne DeWitt Hall, who is the author of the Where True Love Is books. We spoke about a lot of things, her experiences identifying as ace and discovering about asexuality in a time where information about asexuality didn't exist, about how she writes about sex as an ace person and how her asexuality may influence her writing, and also just some other really interesting topics. I really enjoyed this discussion, and I was surprised at how similar our experiences were, despite the fact that we come from very different backgrounds and are very different people otherwise. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and yeah, I'll just go ahead and start it. So today I'm talking to Suzanne about her writing and the experiences as her identifying as an ace person. But I'd like to start with just letting you introduce yourself, if that's okay.
Oh, that would be great. My name, as you've already said, is Suzanne DeWitt Hall. I am an author and an activist and a novelist. My pronouns are she, her, hers, although I debate about going she, they, but that's probably another topic. And how I identify. Boy, that's a hard one. I think I am definitely a demi leaning ace, but I'm not sure about romanticism. I think I might be pan, but I'm not actually sure. So how's that for a long drawn out answer?
Yeah, that's great. I think it's quite common in the ace community to be questioning a bit. So out of curiosity, when did you find out that you were ace?
It's really been since I had a label, and I'm guessing this a common experience, especially for people more in my generation than perhaps yours, because asexuality wasn't really talked about. So I didn't have a label for it until the past maybe 5 years, maybe a little bit less even. I just thought initially, as a younger person, I just thought that all girls didn't really weren't obsessed with sex like guys were, and a lot of the cultural influences around me sort of backed that up. So it wasn't until I started writing for the queer community and being more involved in it, meeting more people, reading more, that I was more fully introduced into the ace spectrum. And then the light bulb goes off and goes ding, 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 that's you. So up until then, I think I kind of wavered between thinking something was wrong with me, that normal people have different kinds of sex drives and get hot and tingly when someone walks by, all those things, which I didn't really experience. And then I, finally had an understanding that there's tons of people like me. So relatively recently.
Yeah, I think that's quite a common experience because the language is only coming about nowadays. A lot of people just felt like they were different but didn't have any words to describe it. So I think it's really good that there's more of that information getting out there for people who, like yourself, have felt a bit different from everyone else. And I definitely agree with the whole, I think there's more of a societal expectation on men to be sexual versus women. So it can, I think, and I imagine it was more so back then as well, because I think sexuality in general is more talked about nowadays, and women's sexuality is more openly spoke about. But yeah, what I wanted to touch on was that you said you started writing for the queer community. I'm interested in what led you to that in particular.
Sure. So I had a dysfunctional upbringing, and I got married to my high school sweetheart, and that was a very dysfunctional relationship. And I always felt kind of, I would say spiritually hungry. I felt unhappy and spiritually hungry. And so I started going to a church when when things were kind of at rock bottom, and being part of that community was like a lifeline that helped pull me through a bunch of very hard years. Like I said, I was married to my high school sweetheart. He was a guy. And while at that church, which was patriarchal, it had an all male governance structure all the way up to a patriarch, a very socially conservative. While there, I met this person whose name was Diane at the time, came to my Bible study that I was leading, and we became friends. And then a couple of years later, something just switched, and we were suddenly in love. It just transformed. Now they were in a marriage that was also kind of self-destructing with also a man, and both of us had been raised to believe, or not raised, but in my case, it wasn't raised. My understanding formed by faith and purity culture was that, being gay was intrinsically disordered, was the phrase that I was kind of most familiar with. And their training was sort of Baptist and Baptist conservative Methodist. And so they were more of the go to hell, sinful kind of a view. So both of us were extremely confused about what the heck was going on, but we knew it was a very good thing. And so after our, relationship with that church exploded and we were together, we continued to be like looking at the Christian scripture and talking and studying and all these things. And because I'm a writer, I was capturing our thoughts as we're progressing through evaluating things in a different way. And those translated into books. So my first one was called Where True Love Is. And that's a devotional for LGBTQIA plus folks and their allies generally. And then there was one for, the next one was called Transfigured. It's for transgender and genderqueer people. And then they kind of followed on from there. And so so your question, I started down my story. I forgot what
no,
it was.
That's fine. This was great.
So I think you said, how did I get kind of enmeshed into the community? So as part of unwrapping and unfolding these books, my spouse, whose name is Declan, now that's their chosen name. He's a trans guy, best dude in the world, no offense. And so he kind of was on while I was discovering and realizing that I was ace, he was able to recognize his own reality throughout his whole life and embrace the fact that he's trans. So we were both on these sort of parallel paths that were not unfolding at the same times, but both of us having these moments of recognition. And he was building this Where True Love Is online community, particularly in Facebook, which just provides a lot of encouragement, information, affirmation, all kinds of stuff for the queer community. And so we just, ended up having a lot more queer friends and reading a lot more about topics of gender and sexual orientation and all that kind of thing. So that's how we sort of stumbled into it. And that's also why I'm not quite sure on how to identify my sexual orientation, because I was ace, but I always assumed I was hetero. And then I know that there are demi aspects, because the people that I did have sexual relationships were the people that I would connect with on an intellectual and an emotional level. And now here I am with a trans guy, and he's my fave ever. So it's kind of hard for me to be able to know really what my orientation is, other than ace.
Yeah, I guess because you're already in that committed relationship, it's difficult to then say, oh, am I feeling this way because I'm already have a strong emotional bond with them, or and it does that bother you, or are you comfortable with just identifying as ace?
That's a good question. That's a very good question. I don't think anyone has ever asked me that. does it bother me? It's a weird thing. Do you think it's a weird thing?
No, not at all. The reason it came up is because I'm currently dating a guy. I'm dating a guy and we'll be dating for a while. And I'm kind of not sure where I fit on the age spectrum at the moment.
I see.
And but what I came to the conclusion of is that I'm comfortable in the relationship I am at the moment, and I'm comfortable with myself in that relationship. So for me, I don't feel like I need to explore that any further.
Yeah.
If at any point I wanted to, then I could. But I think because I'm already in that stable relationship, it doesn't matter as much to me to like investigate that about myself.
Yeah, I think that describes me pretty well too. And sometimes I think that there's almost some unspoken pressure to find the best possible label or something for ourselves. But I don't know why and why that is really necessary. And I don't know how I would even go about figuring it out, because I am in this invested relationship and have no interest whatsoever in being outside of it. So it probably doesn't even matter.
Yeah, I think like labels can be very useful for like communicating to other people and for learning about yourself and finding other people who are like you. But it doesn't mean that it's something you have to have or you have to have pinned down at any point in your life. It's a tool that can be useful, but if it's something you don't need, then that's perfectly fine too.
And something that can change too, as
exactly.
It can shift.
So you shouldn't really feel tied down to a particular orientation or gender identity. If you feel one way a certain day and that fits and that's comfortable for you, identify as that. And if a couple of days later you feel different, then feel free to either sit in the questioning zone or
I thought you were asking me if it was uncomfortable to be ace generally, and I think that's probably a more nuanced question. And you would probably answer differently than you just did as well, because societally it's sort of strange, and it can be, and communicating with potential partners, I would imagine could be tricky. I haven't gone through that. I only went through it where we were realizing it together, and that had its own complexity. But to be like looking for a romantic partner, knowing that you're ace, it probably has some trickiness to it, as far as when do you tell them, and how do you, right? Yeah.
No, I definitely agree that it's a difficult thing to navigate, because some people are just going to not want, they either don't know or they don't want to date someone who's asexual, or anyone on the ace spectrum really. But I guess talking about sex more specifically, I'd be interested to know about your relationship with it, whether that's like sexual attraction, what sex in your writing, anything that comes to mind really.
Yeah. So when we first started talking offline here, I was saying, why would an asexual want to write so much about sex? And for me, sex, and I don't know about what your experience has been like, because I don't think I ever heard your story about when you recognized it. But for me, sex has always been a huge part of my functioning emotionally within society and within community, right? It was, all my friends as a teenager, all my friends were obsessed with it. And so just as far, as going along with everybody else, I just assumed that that's the way it was. And I assumed other people, felt the same way I did, but you just kind of jump in. And then it became for me something where I knew that it can be used for affirmation and for connection, and for kind of creating bonds or getting attention, all these kinds of things, and because I was always seeking for this intimacy that I didn't experience with the person who became my spouse, who I was in a relationship for a long time and then became my spouse. the kind of intimacy I wanted wasn't the kind of intimacy we had. We had physical intimacy, but we didn't have that connection that I was so hungry for. And I think that most humans, not most, I don't know, for example, I don't know that much about aromanticism, and if aromantics, how much they still hunger for intimacy, even if it's not romantic intimacy, you know what I'm saying? But for me, all of that was interconnected, and I thought sex was a requirement for that, and in some ways, the primary tool for achieving that. And so, because of all the dysfunction in my upbringing, I approached sex, and I think what was quite an unhealthy way, because I was using it as this tool, and because I wasn't getting a whole ton of enjoyment out of it, because I didn't view it really as something for me to be getting pleasure and joy out of. I was using it as the tool for getting intimacy out of. It created a lot of it was just kind of like a driving force, even despite the fact that I'm ace. Sex was still really a driving force in my life. I think in our society, that's probably often the case.
I think, like you were saying, that I don't think you can really escape sex wholeheartedly in society. It's going to play a part at some point in your life. You can choose not to interact with that, but it will influence it in some way. And I think also that asexual people or aspec people aren't necessarily non-sexual, if that makes sense. You can still be sexual as an ace person. You can still enjoy it for the intimate aspects you were talking about earlier. I'd be curious whether, if you're comfortable sharing, if you enjoy sex now because you've kind of realized that there is that more intimate connection with people you can make through it, or if you're, now that you realize, I'm ace, I don't have to use this tool if I don't want to, whether you've kind of distanced yourself from it.
So my sex life now is better than it's ever been, for a lot of reasons, mostly because of my partner, because, being with the right person is really everything. But also because the communication about it is so different, and because the expectations are so different. And it took a while for us to kind of get to this place where, he had to realize that and work through understanding asexuality enough to recognize that it has nothing to do with him or his attractiveness or his skill or anything else. It's really just about the way my brain and body work together. But in doing that, his view of sex has shifted, and his appreciation of our engagements together has increased, because he recognizes that when I am entering in, it's an act of will in addition to just a bodily reaction, right? But because in the past, the people that he'd been with primarily are, they're responding to a bodily urge, and it's more of a function of nature rather than a lot of intellectual choice and connection that way. So with me, it's much more about the choosing to engage in actions of love and physical actions of love, and choosing physical actions of connection, and in choosing to give or receive pleasure. And so I think it's really transformed both of our understandings of our sexual beings, because sex was a very disruptive force in his life too, in a totally different way than mine. But because we are in this society, it was a driving force and was used in ways that were probably not optimal, just like most humans probably. And so it created space for that conversation to take place, which otherwise never does take place.
I think it's very interesting to talk about it like that, because I think I, in my earlier relationships, didn't have a very good relationship with sex, because I was just almost using it as a tool, because I was like, okay, I can be a good boyfriend and at this point, but I can't want to have sex with this person because I don't feel sexual attraction. So what I was thinking then was, okay, so I need to have sex with him in order to the relationship to be happy, or in order for him to be satisfied. And it wasn't until I got out of those relationships and took some time to think about it myself, where in my current relationship, I'm essentially doing the same thing in a physical level that I was doing then. But from my perspective, I'm not coming at it from I'm doing this solely for that person. It's I'm doing this because I want to do it, because I know it's important to them, and because it's an emotional, like, bonding experience.
And I was just thinking when you were asking me a related question earlier, that in looking back now at these other relationships where I was using sex as the tool, as you were just describing, that I think part of me, that it's hard to almost respect yourself, or to think that they are, I mean, the reality is that part of the reason that they are desiring company with you could be because of the sex, not because of who you are.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you felt that way, but I think it became part of the difficulty of having any kind of real deep connection, was that I had been using it as the primary tool, which was not really part of who I am. It was a skill that I learned. You know what I mean? It's not
exactly. It can feel like you're faking it, or you're just kind of putting on an act for someone if you're coming from that perspective. And it very much resonated with me what you just said right then, because I didn't have much self-respect in terms of sex in a relationship, and I wasn't considering my own feelings, because in my mind at the time, in a twisted way, I thought, I don't need to be thinking about sex in this relationship. It is solely for them, because they're the person who wants sex out of a relationship.
Right. And then it becomes also drudgery, rather than something that is a mutual positive.
Yeah.
I remember reading, I don't know if you've heard this comparison of asexuality to being like, to a plate of donuts. Have you heard this donut?
I think I've had similar analogies, yeah.
But I love it because it's like, some people walk up to a plate of donuts and they're like, oh my God, I love all of those donuts. I want to eat all of those donuts right now. And I don't know how I'm going to stop myself. And some people are like, I like that kind of donut right there. That looks absolutely delicious, and I'm going to bite it. And then there's people who are like, a plate of donuts. But if they eat one, it tastes good. They enjoy it, but they're like, meh, I don't care. And then there's people like, no donuts ever, none. And I'm one of those, there's a donut. Okay, I'll eat one and I'll enjoy it while I'm eating it. But so when it comes to that, makes it easier, I think, for people who are in relationships with allosexual people, because it permits, a sex life more easily than some other kinds of ace experiences do,
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the food analogies always work surprisingly well to talk about sexuality, because I think that's something that everyone understands. It's a universal experience, foods.
Right.
But I did want to circle back to your writing briefly, because I know that's what we were originally were thinking of talking about. We went on a bit of a tangent.
Not really.
I was wondering whether you have ever found it more difficult to write about sexual relationships because of being in the ace community, being on the ace spectrum.
Yeah. Well, as part of that journey that I talked to you about before I met my beloved, and I was feeling this, super deep desire in my heart, and I was attending a church and studying faith as an adult, I started this blog called A Theology of Desire, where I was exploring the writings of mystics and things who had described encounters with God in a way that was almost sexual, and I was, doing my own writing about exploring these kind of concepts and the intersection of Christianity and sexuality. And then, so after I wrote Where True Love Is and Transfigured and some other books in that series, I took that collection and expanded on it and wrote a book called Theology of Desire, which looks like that. And then as a companion book to that, I wrote a book called, it's a little shiny there, so we're getting a lot of glare, but it's called Sex with God. So A Theology of Desire is kind of playing with the idea of our hunger for the divine and the divine's hunger for us, and this mutual drawing and calling. Yeah. And Sex with God is kind of like a post-purity culture exploration of specific sexual issues, because purity culture within the Christian community and more broadly throughout society has been so poisonous and destructive in a million ways. And some of the more popular books that have pushed back against it have an almost anything goes mentality, which I think is potentially also not terribly useful for people to do. That I tend to think that moderation in all things is usually where kind of the happiness for most people lies. Yeah. And so in this book, I was just exploring different things: polyamory, pornography, masturbation, infidelity, all these issues, and saying, okay, where is the point at which the sort of the divine in that if we're entering into sexual behavior, sexual activity, that we're honoring the divine within ourselves, the divine in the other person with whom we're engaging, and with the divine that's sort of all around us. So that's where the title came from, this Sex with God, because the idea that this divine presence is everywhere, and that we need to be honoring of all those things, honoring of ourselves, honoring of the other person. So so writing this book helped me think through, if we have a God who is truly love and not a God who is constrained by the pages of a Bible or any other holy book, right? Or any other human understanding. If there is a God, and it has to be much huger than our human minds can contain. But if they are love, then what does that mean to intimacy? And how does that, how do each of these things play into that? So it's kind of like a totally different approach to considering a pushback from purity culture, while still trying to recognize that the ability for there to be this force of love that is existent, and not just reducing humans and sex to basically urination and defecation, which is kind of the way I see it handled sometimes. And that just didn't seem quite correct to me. Yeah,
and that's definitely a very interesting perspective to have. I'm sure that a lot of people watching the video will be interested to check those out. So I'll steal some links from you later. To pop. Is there anything else? We've kind of come to the end of the questions that I have. Is there anything else you want to say that you've been working on, or you'd recommend people check out?
Oh, so you asked me about writing about sex as an ace person, and I've got a novel launching. It's called The Language of Bodies. It's kind of goes along with the rest of my themes here, but so it's a novel, and it's about the path of revenge that this woman goes on when her wife, who's a trans woman of color, is murdered, because it's happening all over the nation. Yeah. And she goes on this she was so deeply in love with her wife, and kind of spirals into near insanity, really. And there are several sex scenes in there. And you were asking, how do I how does that work? And a lot of it is that I draw from my previous experiences, but also the deep tap of love that I feel now in my relationship. And a lot of what I do write about sex is either one of two things, is either connecting to that deep potential for true intimacy, or focusing on the disrupted, dysfunctional aspects of sex. It's usually one or the other. There's not much in between for me in that writing. So that's called The Language of Bodies, and that launches in October. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. Well, I'm sure a lot of people will want to check that out. I may have finished the book that I'm reading at the moment by then. I'm a very slow reader, as I think I mentioned the other day. But yeah, this has been a fascinating conversation. I'm very surprised at how much I could relate to your experience, because we come from very different backgrounds. Obviously, there's a generational divide. I didn't come from a religious background. I consider myself agnostic because I think it's very, I don't know. I don't have the confidence to decide one way or the other and make a definitive statement as to whether because like you were saying, it's if there is some divine being, then it would be something that is incomprehensible to us as people, just by definition. So, and yes, I'm a scientist at heart, so I need proof either way to to say something definitively.
I get that, but that's a great place of at least humility, right? I mean, which I think is a positive thing to say. I can't even.
Yeah,
I can't know.
I think one of the things I learned in my physics degree is that there's a lot you don't know, and it's okay to say I have no idea. But yeah, despite all that, the difference is there is a lot in your experience that I can personally relate to, and I'm sure people listening will be able to as well. So it's always interesting to see how, despite in terms of intersectionality coming from different places, there can be a lot of similarity between people in the ace community. Yeah,
and I think people sharing their stories is so useful because of that, and for people who are outside listening, then they don't have any understanding, it helps them have a little bit of a window in, and then the people who are in are like, yeah, okay, I get it, someone else understands. Their stories are important. And thank you for doing what you're doing for that very reason.
You're welcome.
Being that window.
Yes, and I'm sure your writing and all that has been very useful for people as well, having that ace perspective on some of these issues, because I know it's not talked about much in the community and by people in the community, because obviously a lot of people just aren't interested.
That's true. It's not sexy. It's not asexuality is not sexy.
But thank you for talking to me. I think we'll leave it there.
It was great. Thank you.
I did forget while I was talking to her to ask me my token question that I ask guests, which is, what is your favorite cake? The response in this case was raspberry chocolate cake with chocolate ganache, which sounds delicious. I messaged her after the fact and asked her the question just so I could include it here, and I'm glad I did, because that cake sounds absolutely divine. I'd like to give huge thanks for Suzanne for talking with me. It was a really enlightening discussion, and I really hope you guys enjoyed it too. That's all I had to say today though. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I shall see you next time. Goodbye!